The scent of sun-baked figs and ancient parchment filled the air, a fragrance Daniel had known as the very breath of peace. In the quiet courtyard of his family's estate in Jerusalem, under the shade of a gnarled olive tree, the world was a tapestry of order and light. His fingers, stained with the ink of his studies, traced the sacred words on a scroll of Isaiah. The prophet's verses spoke of judgment and hope, of kingdoms that rise like dust devils and vanish, and of a sovereign God who remains unshaken. At 17, Daniel found more solace in these timeless truths than in the boisterous games of other young men. His life was a gentle rhythm of prayer, study, and contemplation, a path carefully laid within the protective walls of his city, and the deeper sanctuary of his faith that his friends were near. Hananiah, his face a mask of concentration, practiced the intricate art of calligraphy, his brush strokes deliberate and strong. Much like his character, Mishael, ever the observer, sat quietly, his sharp eyes missing nothing, his mind a storehouse of knowledge and quiet wisdom. And then there was Azariah, whose spirit burned with a passionate fire, his heart quick to defend their heritage and their God. They were for souls bound by a shared devotion, brothers not by blood, but by a covenant that ran deeper than lineage. Their world, they believed, was as enduring as the stones of the temple that gleamed on the holy mount, a beacon of God's presence on earth. But peace is a fragile veneer, and that afternoon, it was shattered. It began not with a bang, but with a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the stone floors of the city. It was a sound that did not belong to the earth or the sky, a man-made tremor of impending doom. The birds in the olive tree fell silent. A shadow fell over the courtyard, not from a passing cloud, but from a vast, suffocating plume of smoke rising from the city's northern farmlands. Then came the screams. The symphony of terror erupted, the clang of bronze siege engines, the splintering of ancient gates, the roar of a thousand-throated army chanting in a harsh, foreign tongue. The Babylonian war machine, a relentless beast of iron and ambition, had arrived. Daniel and his friends rushed to the balustrade overlooking the city streets. The scene below was a maelstrom of chaos. Hulking soldiers, their faces obscured by grim helmets, moved with brutal efficiency, their short swords and heavy shields a tide of death washing through the terrified populace. Flames, hungry and orange, licked at the cypresswood homes, devouring generations of history in moments. A squad of soldiers burst into their courtyard, led by a scarred commander whose eyes were as cold and empty as a winter sky. His name was Kellen, a man whose reputation for ruthless effectiveness had preceded him. He scanned the young men, his gaze lingering on their fine robes and the scrolls scattered at their feet. "The king requires the best," he grunted, his voice like grinding stones. "The brightest, the strongest, the ones with no flaws. You will serve the great King Nebuchadnezzar." There was no room for argument. They were herded from their home, the scrolls of God's law trampled under the soldiers' merciless boots. As they were forced into the street, Daniel caught a final glimpse of the temple, its golden facade sullied by the black smoke of a city in its death throes. A profound, aching question tore through his heart. Where are you, my God, in this storm of fire and steel? The march to Babylon was a funeral procession for their former lives. They were part of a long, shuffling column of captives, the elite of Judah, princes, scribes, artisans now reduced to property, the desert sun beat down on them, the dust of the road caking their tear-streaked faces. Round them, the sounds of weeping and despair were a constant lament. Yet, the four friends remained a small island of stillness in the turbulent sea of grief. When Azariah's fiery spirit threatened to boil over into a defiant shout, Hananiah's steady hand on his shoulder was enough to calm him. When Mishael's observant eyes filled with the horror of their plight, Daniel would meet his gaze, a silent exchange passing between them, a promise to remember who they were and whose they were. After weeks of grueling travel, a new sight rose from the heat-shimmered horizon. It was not a mountain range, but a city of such impossible scale that it seemed to defy the laws of nature. Babylon, its outer walls, wide enough for chariots to race upon, were glazed in brilliant blue brick, adorned with menacing dragons and powerful bulls. The legendary Ishtar Gate loomed before them, a monumental archway of breathtaking artistry and intimidating power. This was the heart of the empire, a testament to human pride and military might. A city built on the plunder of 100 conquered nations. It was a place of terrifying majesty and profound spiritual darkness. A golden cage designed to awe its captives into submission. They were led through the city's grand processional way, past towering ziggurats that clawed at the sky and opulent palaces dripping with wealth. The air was thick with the smells of exotic spices, open sewers, and the cloying incense of pagan temples. Here, 1,000 gods were worshipped, their grotesque idols staring from every street corner. As they were brought before a high-ranking official, a man named Ashpenaz, the chief of the king's court, Daniel felt the full weight of their displacement. They were no longer in the land of their God. They were in the domain of Marduk, Bel, and a pantheon of deities carved from stone. And would Ashpenaz, a man with shrewd, calculating eyes, inspected the young men from Judah. He saw past their grime and exhaustion, recognizing the spark of intelligence and the strength of their noble bearing. "You four," he declared, his voice smooth but edged with authority. "You have been chosen for the king's service. You will be educated in our language, our literature, our ways. You will be remade." He paused, a faint smile touching his lips. "You will be given new names to reflect your new lives, and you will eat from the king's own table. A great honor." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Remade, new names, the king's food. It was not an offer. It was a command. This was the first test, the first subtle demand for compromise. In the heart of this glittering, godless empire, surrounded by overwhelming power and seductive luxury, Daniel knew their journey had just begun. This was the crucible, where their faith would either be forged into an unbreakable blade or melt into forgotten dust. He looked at his friends, and in their eyes, he saw the same resolve that burned in his own soul. They would not break. They would not bow. Their new life began in a wing of the royal palace reserved for the king's special wards. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, a gilded cage designed to dazzle and disarm. Sunlight streamed through intricately carved alabaster, screens illuminating rooms adorned with silken cushions, cedarwood furniture inlaid with ivory, and vibrant frescoes depicting the triumphs of Babylonian gods and kings. Yet, for Daniel and his friends, the opulence felt like a shroud. Every luxury was a link in a chain being forged to bind them to this new world, and every comfort was a whisper to forget the old one. Their days fell into a rigorous, unyielding routine. From dawn until dusk, they were immersed in the Chaldean arts and sciences. They sat in lecture halls where stern-faced tutors taught them the complex, wedge-shaped cuneiform script, their styluses scratching onto wet clay tablets. They were made to memorize the epic poems of the empire tales of Marduk slaying the chaos monster, Tiamat to create the world, stories that were a perverse echo of their own sacred Genesis. They studied astronomy, learning to chart the stars not as a testament to God's magnificent creation, but as a means to divine the future, a practice anathema to their faith. It was a relentless assault on their minds, an attempt to overwrite the sacred truths etched on their souls with the grand, self-aggrandizing narrative of Babylon. The most profound violation, however, came on the day Ashpenaz summoned them to his formal office. He sat behind a large, polished desk, flanked by two imposing guards. "The king has taken a personal interest in your progress," he began, his voice devoid of warmth. "To complete your integration, to sever the last ties to a defeated land, your identity must be reborn in the glory of the empire. You will be given new names, names of honor, names that bind you to the divine powers that bless this kingdom." He pointed a slender finger at Hananiah, whose name meant Yahweh is gracious. "You," Ashpenaz declared, "shall be called Shadrach, in honor of the moon god Aku." His finger moved to Mishael. "Who is what God is, you shall be Meshach. Who is what Aku is," a fitting parallel. He then turned to Azariah. "Yahweh has helped. You will be Abednego, the servant of Nego, the shining one." His gaze, sharp and penetrating, finally fell on Daniel. "And you, Daniel, God is my judge," a name of singular, stubborn focus. "From this day forward, you are Belteshazzar, the prince of Bel. You will carry the name of the son of our chief god, Marduk." A suffocating silence filled the room. The names were not just new labels. They were spiritual brands, declarations of ownership by foreign gods. To answer to these names was to acknowledge their power. Daniel felt a cold fury rise within him, a righteous anger that he quickly tempered with prayer. He bowed his head, slightly, a gesture of submission that masked a heart of granite resolve. They could change his name, but they could not change his identity. He was Daniel, and his God alone was his judge. The final stage of their indoctrination was presented as the greatest honor of all. Each evening, the young trainees were ushered into a vast dining hall. The air was thick with the aroma of roasted meats, exotic spices, and the sweet, heavy scent of fermented date wine. Long tables groaned under the weight of golden platters piled high with delicacies. From every corner of the empire, lamb slow roasted with pomegranates, fish seasoned with rare herbs from the distant sea, pastries filled with honey and nuts, and goblets of the king's finest, darkest wine. This was the king's own provision, food that had first been offered up on the altars of the Babylonian gods, a sacramental feast dedicated to idols of gold and stone. Night after night, the other captives and young Babylonian nobles feasted, with gusto, their laughter echoing off the high, vaulted ceilings. But Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah stood apart. They could not partake. To eat this food was to participate in idolatry. To drink this wine was to toast the very gods, whose followers had desecrated their temple and enslaved their people. It was an act of spiritual treason. For days, they subsisted on the bread that was available and drank only water. Their refusal a quiet but conspicuous act of defiance. Their gauntness began to show one evening in the privacy of their chambers. Azariah's fiery spirit broke free. "How long must we endure this?" he hissed. His hands clenched into fists. "They defile us with their teachings. They brand us with their gods' names. And now they expect us to feast on their unholy sacrifices. It is an abomination." "Patience, Azariah," Hananiah counseled, his voice a steady anchor. "An open revolt will only lead to our destruction. We must be wise." Mishael, who had been staring out at the city lights, turned to them. "This is not about the food," he said softly, his insight cutting to the core. "This is about the heart. They are testing our allegiance. If we yield here, we signal that everything is negotiable." All eyes turned to Daniel. He had been silent, his head bowed not in despair, but in deep thought and prayer. He looked up, his expression calm but resolute. "Mishael is right," he said. "We cannot defile ourselves, but Azariah is also right. We cannot be foolish. Rebellion is not the path. There's another way, a way of faith." He stood, his decision made. "I will speak to Ashpenaz. I will not make a demand, but a request. I will trust God to grant us favor in his eyes." The decision settled over them, a quiet peace displacing the tension. They chose faith over fear, conviction over the seductive, comfort of compromise. The next morning, Daniel respectfully requested a private audience with the chief official. Ashpenaz received him with an air of weary impatience. "Belteshazzar," he began, deliberately using the new name, "I have noticed your abstinence. You and your friends grow thin. This is not acceptable. If the king sees you looking unwell, he will see it as my failure. It is my head he will demand." His voice was laced with genuine fear. Daniel bowed low, a picture of humility. "Please, my lord," he said, his voice steady and clear, "do not mistake our actions for disrespect. It is a matter of our conscience before our God. We do not wish to cause you trouble. Therefore, I ask for a test. Please, test your servants. For 10 days, give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. At the end of that time, compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food. Then do with your servants as you see fit." Ashpenaz stared at him, bewildered. The request was audacious, illogical, a diet of simple vegetables against the rich, nourishing food of the king. It was a recipe for disaster. He saw the earnestness in Daniel's eyes, the unshakable conviction that was not born of arrogance, but of a deep, quiet certainty. He was a man accustomed to threats, bribes, and political maneuvering. He did not know what to make of this humble, unwavering faith. For a long moment, he was silent, weighing the risk to his own life against the strange plea of this captive. Finally, with a deep, reluctant sigh, he nodded. 10 days, he conceded. But if you fail, there will be no second chances. The test had begun. The 10-day test became a silent spectacle within the palace walls, while the other trainees gorged themselves on the king's rich fare. Daniel and his 3 friends were served simple meals in a quiet corner of the grand dining hall. Their platters held not roasted lamb or honeyed cakes, but humble lentils, crisp cucumbers, sun-dried dates, and hearty greens. Their goblets contained only clear, cool water. The contrast was stark, and it did not go unnoticed. Murmurs and mocking glances followed them. Rival trainees, ambitious young Babylonians, and assimilated captives alike saw their abstention as a weakness, a foolish piety that would surely lead to their downfall. A young Chaldean noble named Zorak, known for his sharp tongue and competitive spirit, often sneered as they passed. Look at the ascetics. Do they think their phantom god will fatten them with prayers? For Daniel and his friends, each simple meal was an act of worship. Before they ate, they would bow their heads in a silent prayer of gratitude, a ritual that drew both curiosity and contempt. They were not merely eating vegetables. They were partaking in God's provision, drawing a line in the sand that separated them from the defilement of the empire. The plainness of the food sharpened their senses and clarified their minds. Free from the heavy, wine-induced lethargy that often settled over the other trainees after their feasts, the 4 friends found their studies invigorated. The complex cuneiform characters seemed to arrange themselves with greater clarity. The intricate astronomical charts and historical annals became easier to memorize and understand. Their minds, unclouded, became keen instruments. Azariah's fiery impatience transformed into a focused discipline. Hananiah's quiet strength became a source of encouragement for them all. Mishael's observant nature allowed him to anticipate the political currents of the court, warning them of Zorak's subtle attempts to discredit them before their tutors. And Daniel, their anchor, led them in prayer 3 times a day. They would find a secluded alcove on a high balcony, facing west towards the distant, ruined city of Jerusalem. There, they would kneel and pour out their hearts to the God who seemed so far away, yet felt so intimately present. Their prayers were not desperate pleas for survival, but affirmations of trust, whispers of faith against the roaring pride of Babylon. Ashpenaz watched them with a hawk's eye anxiety. Every day, he would discreetly observe them, his stomach churning. With the fear of the king's wrath, he saw them growing not weaker, but more vibrant. He noticed the clarity in their eyes and the quickness of their intellect in the study halls. The tutors, initially skeptical, began to report on their astonishing progress. The Hebrew captives, one remarked to Ashpenaz, they absorb knowledge as a dry sponge absorbs water. Their insights are remarkable. Zorak and his clique, frustrated by their inability to outshine the 4 friends academically, grew more resentful, their whispers turning from mockery to slander. On the morning of the 11th day, the verdict was to be delivered. The air in the dining hall was thick with anticipation. Ashpenaz, his face a grim, unreadable mask, commanded Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah to stand before him. He then called forward a group of the most robust young men who had feasted on the king's provisions, including the smugly confident Zorak. The 2 groups stood side by side, a living tableau of the test. A hush fell over the hall. Ashpenaz walked slowly round them, his sharp eyes scrutinizing every detail. The trainees who had eaten the royal food were well fed, their skin plump, and their bodies strong. But there was a certain puffiness to their faces, a dullness in their eyes that spoke of overindulgence. Then he looked at Daniel and his friends. Their skin was clear and held a healthy luster. Their eyes were bright and alert. Their posture was straight and filled with a quiet energy. There was a lean, powerful vitality about them that the others lacked. They were not just healthier, they were radiant. The chief official tried to hide his astonishment, but a flicker of disbelief crossed his face. He had expected pale, emaciated figures, a cautionary tale to present to the king. Instead, he saw 4 young men who looked healthier and better nourished than any of the others. The God of the Hebrews, a deity he neither knew nor understood, had answered their humble test with a visible, undeniable miracle. The logic of his world, a world governed by power and physical sustenance, had been upended. He turned to the hall, his voice ringing with an authority that silenced all whispers. From this day forward, he announced, his gaze sweeping over the astonished faces, these four will continue with the diet they have chosen. Their steward will provide for them as they have requested. He then fixed Zorok with a cold stare that wiped the smirk from his face. Let their example be a lesson. Favor is not always found on a golden platter. The victory was quiet but profound. It wasn't just about their diet. It was a testament to the power of conviction. They had chosen faith over fear, and God had honored their obedience in a way that all could see. This small act of faithfulness earned them a new level of respect, even from their rivals. More importantly, it secured the favor of Ashpenaz, who now saw them not as a liability, but as men protected by a powerful, unseen force. But God's blessing did not end with their physical well-being. As they continued in their studies, a deeper transformation was taking place. The knowledge they were forced to learn was filtered through the lens of their faith. They excelled beyond all their peers, not just in memorization, but in wisdom and understanding. The Lord gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom. But to Daniel, he gave something more. He was blessed with a unique, divine gift, the ability to understand visions and dreams of all kinds. It was a seed of prophecy, planted in the fertile ground of his unwavering faithfulness, a gift that lay dormant, waiting for the moment it would be called upon to change the course of an empire and reveal the grand design of God himself. Their first test was over, but it was only a prelude. The foundation of trust had been laid, preparing them for the greater, more terrifying trials that lay ahead. 2 years passed. Daniel and his friends, now known by their Babylonian names Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, had completed their training. Their wisdom and understanding had so impressed King Nebuchadnezzar that he had appointed them to positions of influence within his court, placing them among his most trusted counselors. They walked the corridors of power, their simple Hebrew robes a stark contrast to the extravagant attire of the Chaldean nobles. Their presence was a quiet, constant reminder of a different kingdom and a different king. Nebuchadnezzar ruled his vast empire with an iron fist. He was a man of colossal ambition and volatile temperament, a brilliant strategist and a ruthless tyrant. His moods were the weather of Babylon. When he was pleased, the sun shone on the court, but when he was angered, a terrifying storm would break, and no one was safe from the lightning of his wrath. He saw himself as more than a man, a living God whose will was the supreme law of the land. The world, as he saw it, was a reflection of his own glory, and he was answerable to no one. One night, this edifice of pride was shaken to its core. In the opulent darkness of his royal bedchamber, Nebuchadnezzar was tormented by a dream. It was not a fleeting, half-remembered fantasy, but a vision of such vivid intensity and profound dread that it tore him from his sleep, leaving him drenched in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs. The images were seared into his mind, yet the narrative, the meaning, remained maddeningly out of reach. Like a word on the tip of his tongue, he knew, with a primal certainty, that this was no ordinary nightmare. It was a message, a portent of immense significance that he could not decipher, and the ignorance gnawed at his soul. The next morning, a palpable tension gripped the palace. The king was a caged lion, pacing his throne room, his eyes burning with a mixture of fear and rage. He summoned his entire retinue of wise men, the magicians with their secret incantations, the astrologers with their celestial charts, the sorcerers with their dark arts, and the Chaldean diviners with their ancient texts. They filed into the great hall, a sea of robed figures, their faces etched with apprehension. "I have had a dream," Nebuchadnezzar roared, his voice echoing off the colossal statues of winged bulls that lined the walls. "My spirit is troubled, and I must know its meaning." A senior magician, an old man named Balak, stepped forward and bowed low. "O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show you the interpretation." A dangerous, cruel light entered the king's eyes. His fear had twisted into a paranoid suspicion. How could he trust their interpretation if they did not first know the dream itself? Anyone could invent a pleasing fable. This would be his test of their true power. The matter is settled by me, he snarled, his voice dropping to a menacing growl. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be cut into pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. The threat was not hyperbole. Every person in the hall had seen the king's capacity for brutal retribution. A collective gasp of terror rippled through the assembled wise men. He leaned forward, his voice now a seductive whisper. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. Panic began to spread. The wise men exchanged terrified glances. Balak, his voice trembling, spoke again. Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. The king's patience snapped. He slammed his fist onto the arm of his throne with a resounding crack. I know with certainty that you are trying to buy time, because, you see, the matter is settled by me. There is but one decree for you. You have conspired to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time be changed. His face was purple with rage. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that. You can show me its interpretation. The wise men fell to their faces, their courage utterly broken. There's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand, they cried out in unison. No great and powerful king has ever asked such a thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. Their admission of powerlessness was the final spark to the king's fury. He saw it as a personal betrayal, an exposure of the hollowness of his own spiritual authority. Incompetent fools, frauds, he bellowed. He turned to Kellen, the ruthless commander who had first taken Daniel captive, now the captain of the king's guard. The decree is given. Find and destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Let not one of them escape. The reign of terror began. Kellen and his soldiers moved through the city with brutal speed. The halls of wisdom became chambers of death. Magicians and sorcerers were dragged from their homes and studies, their pleas for mercy silenced by the swift, cold kiss of a Babylonian blade. The news spread like a plague, a wave of fear that washed over the entire city. Daniel was in his study, conferring with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about a matter of provincial administration, when the heavy tramp of soldiers' boots sounded. Outside his door, Kellen entered without ceremony, his sword already drawn, its bronze surface stained with fresh blood. By the king's decree, Belteshazzar, the captain said, his voice cold and flat, you and your companions are to be executed, along with the rest of the so-called wise men. A cold shock ran through Daniel, but he did not let panic seize him. He held up a hand, his expression a mask of calm, questioning authority. Why is the decree from the king so urgent and harsh? He asked Kellen, his tone reasonable and measured, not pleading. Kellen, momentarily taken aback by Daniel's composure, in the face of death, hesitated. He briefly recounted the story of the king's dream and the failure of the wise men. As he spoke, understanding dawned on Daniel. This was not a random act of tyranny. It was a crisis born of supernatural fear. It was a spiritual problem that could not be solved by earthly power or human wisdom. And in that moment of terrible crisis, he saw an opportunity, a door opened by God himself. Grant me a little time, Daniel said to the captain, his voice filled with a quiet confidence that was utterly compelling. Give me one night. I will go to the king, and I will show him the interpretation he seeks. Kellen stared at the young Hebrew. It was an audacious claim, a gamble against an impossible demand, but he had seen the favor this young man carried. He remembered the verdict of the 10 days. Perhaps, just perhaps, the God of this captive was real. Against his better judgment, against the king's explicit command for immediate execution, he made a choice. One night, Belteshazzar, Kellen grunted, you have until sunrise. If you fail, my head will be the first to fall, and yours will follow swiftly after. He turned and left, leaving Daniel and his friends standing in the sudden, profound silence, the fate of every wise man in Babylon, and their own lives resting squarely on their shoulders. The crucible was heating up. As the heavy footsteps of Kellen and his guards receded down the corridor, the four friends were left in a silence that was more terrifying than the commander's threat. The air was thick with the imminent reality of death. Outside their window, the first torches of the evening were being lit, casting long, dancing shadows across the palace courtyards. For hundreds of other men, this would be their last sunset. A wave of despair washed over Azariah. "It is over," he whispered, slumping against a wall. "We fled the sword in Jerusalem only to die by a madman's whim in Babylon." "No," Daniel said, his voice cutting through the fear with startling force. He turned from the window, his eyes blazing with an intense, focused light. "This is not the whim of a madman. This is the hand of God. Do you not see? All the power of Babylon, all its sorcery and supposed wisdom, has been proven hollow. The king's heart is terrified, and the stage has been emptied. God has silenced the false prophets so that his true voice may be heard." His words were a splash of cold, invigorating water. Hananiah straightened up, his steadfast nature rekindled. Daniel is right. The king's rage is a symptom. The dream is the cause. If we can know the dream, we can know the solution. But how? Mishael asked, his practical mind grappling with the impossibility of the task. No man can know another's hidden thoughts. It is a mystery locked within the king's own mind. It is a mystery to man, Daniel agreed, his gaze sweeping over, his friends drawing them together. But our God is a God who reveals mysteries. We have not been brought to this moment to die, but to be his vessel. He placed a hand on Azariah's shoulder, his touch both firm and gentle. "We will not despair. We will pray, not as condemned men begging for our lives, but as servants asking for the battle plan. We will go before the throne of heaven before. We are forced to stand before the throne of Babylon." A renewed sense of purpose surged through them. They were not just for captives anymore. They were a unit, a prayer legion standing in the breach. They secured the door to their chambers and knelt together on the cool stone floor. As the city of Babylon hummed with its nightly rhythm of commerce and revelry, and as the king's executioners continued their grim work, the small room became a sanctuary, a holy embassy of the kingdom of heaven. Daniel began to pray, his voice low but filled with a powerful current of faith. He did not start with petitions for their own safety. He began with praise, acknowledging the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. "O Lord God of heaven," he began, "yours is the wisdom and the might. You change the times and the seasons. You remove kings and you set up kings. You give wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding." His words painted a picture of a God whose sovereignty dwarfed the fleeting power of Nebuchadnezzar. He was placing their crisis in its proper, eternal context. He was reminding himself and his friends that the tyrant on the throne of Babylon was but a temporary actor on a stage built and managed by God himself. Then, his prayer shifted to confession, not for any specific sin, but for the collective state of their people, acknowledging their shared need for God's mercy. He then moved to the heart of their plea. "You reveal the deep and secret things," Daniel prayed, his voice filled with intensity. "You know what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with you. We ask now, O revealer of mysteries, that you would show us this secret. Unveil the king's dream and its meaning, not for our glory, but for yours. Let your name be hallowed in this pagan land. Let this king, who believes he is a god, be forced to acknowledge the one true God who rules over all." Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah joined him, their voices weaving together in a harmony of desperate faith. They were not just speaking words, they were wrestling. It was an intense, focused, spiritual effort, a laying siege to the gates of heaven with the weapons of humility and trust. They lost all track of time. The sounds of the palace faded away. The fear of execution dissolved in the profound presence that filled the room. They were connected to the source of all knowledge, the very mind of the Creator. Hours passed. The moon climbed high in the sky, a silver disk in a sea of stars. Exhausted, their bodies aching from kneeling, their voices hoarse, they fell into a deep, prayer-induced sleep right there on the floor. It was in this state of complete surrender, his mind emptied of its own striving, that the vision came to Daniel. It was not a dream like the king's. filled with terror and confusion. It was a silent, vivid unfolding of knowledge, a divine download of information directly into his spirit. He saw it all with perfect clarity, a colossal, terrifying statue of a man, its form brilliant and awe-inspiring. He saw the head of gleaming gold, the chest and arms of shimmering silver, the belly and thighs of polished bronze, the legs of hard, unyielding iron. And then he saw the feet, a bizarre and unstable mixture of iron and wet clay. He saw its weakness. Then, from a mountain, he saw a rock, cut out but not by human hands, hurtling through the air. He saw it strike the statue on its fragile feet. The impact was cataclysmic. The entire magnificent structure, the gold, silver, bronze, and iron shattered into a million pieces, becoming like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. A wind came and swept them all away, leaving no trace. And the rock that struck the image grew and grew until it became a great mountain that filled the whole earth. Daniel awoke with a gasp, his heart pounding not with fear, but with overwhelming awe. He sat up, the vision still blazing in his mind. The mystery was solved. The secret was revealed. He gently woke his friends. "He has answered," Daniel whispered, his voice trembling with the aftershock of the divine encounter. He recounted the dream to them in precise detail, and then he explained the interpretation that God had given him along with it. As they listened, their faces transformed from weary apprehension to radiant joy. They fell to their knees once more, but this time, their prayers were not petitions, but an explosive chorus of thanksgiving. "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever," Daniel exclaimed, his voice ringing with triumph. "I thank you and praise you, O God of my fathers. You have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you. For you have made known to us the king's matter." He stood, his resolve now absolute. He walked to the door and flung it open. A lone guard, posted there by Kellen, started in surprise. "Take me to the captain," Daniel commanded, his voice imbued with the authority of one who had just stood. "In the council of the Most High, the executions can stop. I am ready to go before the king." The palace of Nebuchadnezzar was a fortress of fear by sunrise. The bloody work of the previous night had cast a pall over the court, and the surviving nobles and officials moved with the quiet, nervous energy of those who had narrowly escaped a predator. When Daniel was escorted through the grand corridors by a retinue of Kellen's guards, whispers followed him like rustling leaves. He was a dead man walking, a final, desperate gambit in a game where the king held all the cards. Yet Daniel walked not with the shuffling gait of the condemned, but with a straight-backed purpose that radiated an unnerving calm. His focus was not on the gilded throne ahead, but on the eternal throne he had knelt before just hours earlier. Kellen himself met him at the massive bronze doors of the throne room. The captain's face was drawn and weary, the stress of the night's horrific duties etched around his eyes. He looked at Daniel, searching for any sign of deception or bravado. He found none. He saw only a serene, unshakable confidence. "You are staking many lives on this, Hebrew," Kellen said, his voice a low growl, "especially your own." "The God of heaven does not deal in stakes and gambles," Daniel replied evenly. "He deals in truth." With a deep breath, Kellen nodded to the guards, who heaved the great doors open. Daniel stepped inside, and the world seemed to shrink to this one cavernous space. The throne room was designed to intimidate, to crush the spirit of any who entered. The ceilings were impossibly high, lost in shadow. Light from high, narrow windows cut through the gloom, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air like lost souls. The air was cold and heavy with the scent of power and old blood. And at the far end of the room, seated upon a throne carved from black obsidian and adorned with snarling golden lions, was Nebuchadnezzar. The king was a figure of terrible majesty. He was clad in robes of deep purple and black, his powerful frame seeming to absorb the very light around him. His face, framed by a square, intricately plaited beard, was a thundercloud of impatience and barely suppressed fury. The memory of his dream and the humiliation of his wise men had stoked his rage into a simmering volcano. He watched Daniel's approach, his eyes narrowed to slits, his expression a mixture of contempt and a tiny, desperate flicker of hope dot at the foot of the dais. Daniel stopped and bowed low, his forehead nearly touching the polished marble floor. He remained there, a posture of profound respect for the office, if not the man. "Rise." The king's voice boomed, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the hall. "The captain of my guard tells me that a captive from Judah claims he can solve the riddle that has baffled the greatest minds of my empire. Are you, a boy from a conquered land, able to make known to me the dream that I saw and its interpretation?" Daniel rose, meeting the king's fiery gaze without flinching. His heart was a steady drum in his chest. He knew this was the pivotal moment. He could claim the power for himself, seize the glory, and perhaps win the king's immediate favor. But that would be a lie, a betrayal of the God who had granted him this revelation. His first words had to be a declaration of truth. "Let the king live forever," Daniel began, his voice clear and resonant, filling the vast hall. "No wise man, enchanter, magician, or diviner can explain to the king the mystery he has asked about." He let the words hang in the air, a direct affirmation of the very failure that had so enraged the king. A dangerous rumble started in Nebuchadnezzar's chest, but Daniel continued, raising his voice slightly. "There's a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has shown to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen in the days to come." He had done it. He had deflected all glory from himself and pointed it directly toward his unseen God. He was not the hero of this story. He was merely the messenger. The king's anger faltered, replaced by a stunned, intense curiosity. This was a different answer. It was bold, audacious, and utterly unexpected. "Your dream," Daniel said, his eyes locking with the king's, "and the visions that passed through your mind as you lay on your bed, are these." Daniel began to speak, and as he did, the throne room seemed to fade away. He described the vision with such precision, such vivid detail, that it was as if he were painting the king's own memory back to him. "You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great statue. The statue, which was mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening." Nebuchadnezzar leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his throne. His breath caught in his throat. This was it. This was the terrifying image from his soul. The head of the statue was of fine gold. Daniel continued, his voice steady. "Its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay." Every word was a hammer blow of truth, dismantling the king's suspicion and building a bridge of awe. This young man knew. He knew. As you looked, Daniel's voice dropped to a dramatic whisper. "A stone was cut out, but not by human hands. It struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all crushed together and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found." He paused, letting the image of total annihilation settle in the king's mind. "And the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth." Daniel fell silent. The king was motionless, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and wonder. The secret that had been locked in his mind, a torment he thought was his alone, had been laid bare by this young Hebrew captive. The first impossible part of the demand had been met. "This was the dream," Daniel said softly. "Now, we will tell the king its interpretation." The word "we" was deliberate, a subtle inclusion of his praying friends, a humble acknowledgement that this was a shared revelation from their God. The king of the world, the tyrant who held the power of life and death, was now held captive by the words of a servant of the Most High God, waiting, desperate, to understand the fate of his kingdom and the meaning of his own existence. The silence in the throne room was absolute, a void waiting to be filled. Nebuchadnezzar did not speak. He scarcely breathed. His entire being was focused on Daniel, the young man who had just unlocked the most secret chamber of his mind. All the power and fury of the king had dissolved into the raw, vulnerable need of a man desperate for answers. Daniel, feeling the weight of the moment and the divine truth he was about to unleash, took a slow breath. He was no longer just a captive trying to save his life. He was a prophet of God, standing at the crossroads of history and destiny. Tasked with explaining the grand, sweeping arc of God's plan for the ages, you, O King, Daniel began, his voice resonating with a newfound authority, are the King of Kings. The God of heaven has given you the kingdom, the power, the strength, and the glory. Wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, or the birds of the heavens, He has given them into your hand, and has made you ruler over them all. He paused, allowing the king to absorb the affirmation of his greatness, but framing it immediately as a gift from a higher power. You, Daniel declared, his finger pointing not at the king, but at the image of the statue in their minds, are this head of gold. A flicker of pride, of recognition, crossed Nebuchadnezzar's face. Gold, it was fitting. His Babylon was a city of unparalleled wealth and splendor, a golden empire. He was the golden king. But Daniel's tone shifted, becoming more somber. After you, another kingdom will rise, inferior to yours. He gestured mentally to the statue's chest and arms. This is the kingdom of silver. It will be strong, but it will lack the pure, unified glory of your own reign. The king's brow furrowed. The thought of another kingdom succeeding his was a jarring, unwelcome idea. His empire was meant to be eternal, a monument to his own genius. Then Daniel continued, his voice painting a vivid historical tapestry. A third kingdom, one of bronze, will rule over all the earth. Its reach will be vast, its armies swift and conquering, spreading its dominion to the four corners of the world. He was speaking of a future he could not naturally know, yet the words flowed from him with the certainty of a historian recounting the past. And the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, Daniel said, his voice taking on a harder edge. For iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all the others. He described an empire of ruthless military might, a brutal, unyielding force that would dominate the world with unparalleled strength and discipline. The imagery was stark and terrifying. Nebuchadnezzar listened, captivated and horrified. His own golden age seemed to shrink in the face of these successive, powerful empires. But Daniel had not yet revealed the most perplexing part of the vision. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. There will be in it some of the strength of iron, but it will also be a brittle, fractured kingdom. He looked directly at the king, explaining the strange paradox. Just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. It will be a kingdom of inherent weakness, of internal conflict, strong in parts, but ultimately unstable, and doomed to crumble from within. The vision was now a complete panorama of human history, a relentless cycle of power rising and falling, of glory giving way to decay. It was a bleak and sobering revelation for a man who believed his own power was absolute. But the most stunning part of the prophecy was yet to come. And in the days of these kings, Daniel's voice rose, filled with a transcendent hope that seemed to illuminate the shadowy throne room. The God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. His eyes shone with the light of this final, ultimate truth. This kingdom will not be left to other people. It will crush and bring to an end all these other kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. He brought the king's mind back to the final, dramatic image of the dream. This is the meaning of the stone that you saw cut out of the mountain, but not by human hands, a stone that broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. This kingdom was different. It was not a product of human ambition, conquest, or political maneuvering. It was of divine origin, supernatural, and unstoppable. He concluded with a powerful affirmation of the source of his knowledge, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. He fell silent. The air crackled with the aftermath of his words. He had laid out a prophetic roadmap of the future, foretelling the rise and fall of the Medo-Persian silver, Greek bronze, and Roman iron empires with stunning accuracy, culminating in a divided, unstable final human power. And then, beyond all of it, he had proclaimed the coming of an eternal, divine kingdom that would supersede all human endeavors. Nebuchadnezzar sat motionless on his throne, his mind reeling. He had asked for the solution to a troubling dream, and in response, he had been given the history of the world in advance. He had been shown the fleeting nature of his own glory and the ultimate sovereignty of a god. He did not know. The arrogance and rage that had defined him just hours before had been completely stripped away, leaving him bare and humbled before the magnitude of this revelation. Slowly, as if in a trance, the most powerful man in the world slid from his obsidian throne before the shocked eyes of his guards and courtiers. King Nebuchadnezzar, the conqueror of nations, the self-proclaimed God King, fell prostrate on the cold marble floor. He lowered his face to the ground before Daniel, the young Hebrew captive. Truly, the king's voice was a choked, awestruck whisper. Your God is a God of gods, the Lord of kings, and a revealer of secrets, since you could reveal the secret. The tyrant had bowed. The God King had worshipped in the heart of the world's most powerful empire. The name of the one true God had been exalted, not by force of arms, but by the quiet courage of a faithful servant and the undeniable power of divine truth. The aftermath of the dream's revelation transformed Daniel's standing in the empire overnight. Awed and humbled, Nebuchadnezzar showered him with honors. He promoted Daniel to be the ruler over the entire province of Babylon and the chief prefect over all the wise men, a position of immense political and intellectual authority. The very men who were to be executed alongside him now answered to him. At Daniel's request, the king also appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to oversee the administration of the province, placing the four friends at the very heart of the empire's governance. They used their influence with wisdom and integrity, becoming known for their justice and compassion, a quiet testament to the character of their God. But the king's humility, born in a moment of supernatural terror, was a shallow-rooted plant. As the years passed and the memory of the dream's chilling power began to fade, his old pride, watered by the constant adulation of his court, began to grow back, stronger and more arrogant than before. The prophecy of the succeeding kingdoms, silver, bronze, iron, gnawed at him. The idea that his golden kingdom would one day give way to an inferior power was an intolerable insult to his ego. He, Nebuchadnezzar, would defy the prophecy. He would forge an empire that would never end. His defiance took shape in a monument of spectacular, breathtaking arrogance. On the flat, sun-scorched plain of Dura, a vast expanse visible for miles, the king commanded the construction of a colossal statue. But this was not the multi-metalled figure from his dream. This statue was made entirely of pure, gleaming gold. It stood 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. A towering, monolithic finger of defiance pointed at the heavens. It was a physical rejection of God's revealed plan, an idol forged from the king's own hubris. It was Nebuchadnezzar's declaration. My kingdom is not just the head of gold. It is all gold, and it will last forever. When the monument was complete, its polished surface blinding in the Babylonian sun, the king issued a decree to every corner of his empire. All the satraps, prefects, governors, counselors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces were to gather for its dedication. It was to be the single greatest political and religious event in the history of his reign. A massive, colorful crowd assembled on the plain of Dura. It was a living map of the empire, a sea of officials from 100 different lands, all subjects of the one great king. Among them, standing together, were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel, it seemed, was away on official state business, providentially absent from this looming crisis of faith, a royal herald, his voice amplified by the flat, open space, stepped forward and cried aloud, "To you it is commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up." The decree was absolute, a test of ultimate loyalty. To bow was to acknowledge the king not just as a political sovereign, but as a divine authority, the head of a state religion centered on his own magnificence. The herald's voice then dropped to a chilling, deadly tone, "And whoever does not fall Down, and worship shall immediately be cast into the midst of a blazing fiery furnace nearby. A massive brick furnace had been constructed, its open maw dark, terrifying promise of the punishment for disobedience. The heat shimmering from its entrance was a grim, physical reminder of the king's power and the cost of defiance. Then the signal was given. A wave of sound washed over the plain, a bizarre, cacophonous symphony of instruments from across the empire, the piercing blast of ram's horns, the reedy drone of bagpipes, the shimmering notes of harps and lyres, all blended into a single, overwhelming command of sound. As one, the massive crowd fell, thousands upon thousands of officials, a forest of robed figures, prostrated themselves on the dusty ground, their faces pressed to the earth in adoration of the golden monolith. The plain of Dura became a vast carpet of submission. But amidst this sea of bowed heads, 3 figures remained standing. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stood erect, their faces turned not toward the idol, but toward the heavens. They stood like 3 solitary stone pillars in a flattened field, their defiance a silent, thundering rebuke to the king's command. They would not kneel. Their allegiance was not for sale, not even at the price of their lives. They had made a covenant with the living God, and they would not betray him for a god of lifeless gold. Their act of defiance was instantly noticed. Certain Chaldean officials, men who had long harbored jealousy over the rapid rise of the 3 Hebrews, saw their opportunity. Led by the resentful noble Zorach, they rushed to the king, their faces alight with malicious glee. "O king, live forever," Zorach began, bowing low. "You issued a decree, and it was a just decree. But there are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who have paid no attention to you, O king. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." Nebuchadnezzar's face, which had been beaming with pride at the sight of universal adoration, contorted into a mask of pure fury. The pleasure of 1,000 loyal subjects was instantly erased by the disobedience of 3. It was a personal affront, a challenge to his absolute authority. "Bring them to me," he roared, his voice cracking with rage. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were dragged before the king, who stood trembling with indignation. "Is it true?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Is it true that you do not serve my gods or worship the golden image? I will give you one more chance when the music plays. If you fall down and worship, all will be well. But if you do not worship," he gestured toward the roaring furnace, "you shall be cast into that fire, and then we shall see. What God is there who can deliver you out of my hands?" It was the ultimate challenge, a direct confrontation between the power of an earthly king and the sovereignty of the God of heaven. The 3 friends stood before the raging tyrant, their faces calm, their resolve absolute. The time for silent defiance was over. It was time to give their testimony. The eyes of the entire assembly were fixed on the 3 men. The air was thick, with a tense, expectant silence, broken only by the hungry roar of the fiery furnace. Before them stood Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful man on earth, his face a mask of incandescent rage, his very presence a crushing weight of authority. He had offered them an escape, a final chance to bow to his will and save their lives. It was a bridge of compromise built over a river of fire. Shadrach stepped forward slightly, his gaze meeting the king's not with arrogance, but with a serene and resolute calm that was more powerful than any weapon. He spoke for all 3 of them, his voice clear and steady, carrying across the silent plain. "O Nebuchadnezzar," he began, respectfully but without a trace of fear, "we have no need to answer you in this matter." The king's eyes widened in disbelief. This was not the pleading of condemned men. It was the response of ambassadors from a higher authority, men who did not recognize the jurisdiction of this earthly court. "If that is the case," Shadrach continued, his voice rising with a current of unshakable faith, "the God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the blazing fiery furnace, and he will deliver us from your hand, O king." This was a bold declaration of faith, a statement of trust in God's power to intervene. But it was what he said next that elevated their testimony into a legendary act of pure, unconditional devotion. His voice softened, but lost none of its steel. "But if not," he said, the words echoing with profound significance. Let it be known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods, nor will we worship the golden image which you have set up. But if not, those three words redefined the nature of their faith. Their obedience was not a transaction. Their loyalty to God was not contingent upon their own survival. They were not demanding a miracle. They were simply declaring their allegiance. Whether they lived or died, their trust was not in God's deliverance, but in God Himself. They had relinquished control over the outcome, placing their lives, their deaths, and their eternal souls entirely in His hands. The king was rendered speechless by their audacity. He had expected fear, negotiation, or at the very least, a desperate plea for mercy. Instead, he was met with a calm, absolute refusal, a faith so profound that it was indifferent to the threat of a horrific death. His rage, already at a boiling point, exploded. This was no longer about enforcing a decree. It was a personal war against the unseen God who had inspired such impossible defiance. He is to be made hotter, he screamed, his voice raw and unhinged. He pointed a trembling finger at the furnace. Heat it 7 times more than it is usually heated. His command was one of pure, irrational fury. The furnace was already hot enough to kill instantly. Making it 7 times hotter was a physical impossibility, a madman's order born of a shattered ego. The soldiers responsible for tending the fire frantically stoked the flames, piling on fuel until the brick structure glowed with a terrifying, white-hot intensity. The heat radiating from it became so immense that it was unbearable even from a distance. Nebuchadnezzar turned to the strongest soldiers in his personal guard, men renowned for their physical prowess. Bind these men, he ordered. Bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and cast them into the heart of the blazing fiery furnace. The mighty soldiers seized the 3 friends. They bound them tightly with ropes, leaving them completely helpless. They did not even bother to remove their robes, their trousers, or their hats. Fully clothed, the 3 men were hoisted up, their faces still serene, their eyes turned toward heaven. They were carried towards the furnace's open maw, from which a visible wave of superheated air billowed out. The scene that followed was a shocking, instantaneous testament to the king's insane rage. The elite soldiers, the strongest men in the army, who were tasked with throwing the 3 Hebrews into the fire, could not withstand the inferno they had helped create. As they approached the opening to cast their prisoners in, the searing heat lashed out like an invisible whip. The soldiers were consumed by the very flames meant for their victims. They let out horrifying screams as they were instantly incinerated, their bodies collapsing into charred heaps at the furnace's edge. Bound and helpless, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego tumbled from the dead soldiers' grasp and fell directly into the center of the white-hot inferno. A collective gasp of horror rose from the crowd. The king leaned forward on his platform, a cruel, triumphant smile beginning to form on his lips, expecting to see 3 bodies instantly vaporized into ash. But what he saw next made his blood run cold. The triumphant smile froze on his face, replaced by an expression of utter, slack-jawed astonishment. He leaped to his feet, his eyes wide with disbelief, staring into the roiling heart of the fire. Did we not cast 3 men, bound, into the midst of the fire? He cried out to his counselors, his voice a bewildered, terrified croak. True, O king, they answered, their own faces pale with confusion. Look, Nebuchadnezzar shrieked, pointing a shaking finger into the flames. His voice was filled with a frantic, terrified awe. I see 4 men, loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. He squinted, trying to comprehend the impossible vision unfolding before him. The ropes that had bound the 3 men had been burned away, but the fire had not touched their bodies. They were not screaming in agony or writhing in the flames. They were walking, calmly, freely, as if taking a stroll in a cool garden. And they were not alone. And the form of the 4th, the king whispered, his voice cracking with a fear that transcended anything he had ever known, is like a son of the gods. There, in the very heart of the furnace designed to be a tool of ultimate destruction, was a 4th figure. He was not a man of Babylon or Judah. He shone with a light that seemed to outshine the flames themselves, an ethereal, divine presence. His form was majestic and powerful, and he walked among the three friends with an air of serene command, a guardian who had turned the heart of hell into a holy sanctuary. God had not delivered them from the fire. He had chosen to join them in it. The furnace, meant to be a symbol of Nebuchadnezzar's absolute power, had become a stage for a demonstration of God's ultimate, saving presence. The entire plain of Dura was paralyzed, caught in a spell of terrified wonder. The symphony of imperial power had fallen silent, replaced by the crackling of the furnace and the frantic, shallow breaths of the thousands who witnessed the impossible. Nebuchadnezzar stood frozen on his platform, his mind struggling to process the vision in the flames. The fourth figure, radiating a divine calm, was a presence so powerful it defied all reason. It was a being of light and authority who had rendered the king's ultimate weapon utterly impotent. The fire, stoked by human rage, was powerless against this divine visitor. Slowly, as if moving through a dream, Nebuchadnezzar stumbled down from his viewing platform and approached the mouth of the furnace. The blistering heat that had incinerated his strongest soldiers still billowed out, but the king, driven by a mixture of terror and awe, seemed not to feel it. He stood at the very edge of the abyss, peering into the swirling, white-hot heart of the inferno. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer the roar of a tyrant, but the humbled, trembling call of a man who had come face to face with a power beyond his comprehension. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, he cried out, his voice hoarse, "Servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." At the sound of the king's voice, the three men, who had been walking calmly with their divine protector, turned toward the opening. They walked out of the flames and stepped onto the scorched earth, completely unharmed. The fourth figure did not follow. His work was done. He vanished within the fire, leaving behind only the miracle of his presence. The officials, governors, and counselors surged forward, forming a tight, disbelieving circle round the three men. They stared, their eyes wide with astonishment. Not a hair on their heads was singed. Their robes, which should have been reduced to cinders, were pristine, without even the faintest smell of smoke upon them. The fire had consumed their bonds, setting them free, but it had held no power over their bodies. They had walked through the heart of death and emerged not only alive but untouched, living proof of a God who could command the very elements. Overwhelmed, Nebuchadnezzar raised his hands to the sky. The pride and fury that had defined him moments before had been burned away, replaced by a profound and genuine awe. "Blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego," he declared, his voice ringing across the plain with the conviction of a convert. "He has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him. They have defied the king's word and yielded their bodies, that they might not serve or worship any god except their own God." The king's words were a public confession. He acknowledged their trust, their defiance of his own command, and the exclusive nature of their worship. He, the man who had demanded universal worship, was now praising them for their refusal to comply. He turned to the stunned assembly, his expression now one of fierce, protective zeal for this newfound God. His volatile nature had not vanished. It had simply been redirected. Therefore, he thundered, issuing a new decree with all the force of his imperial authority. "I make a decree, any people, nation, or language that speaks anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut into pieces, and their houses shall be made an ash heap." It was a shocking, brutal edict, characteristic of the king's all-or-nothing personality. But it was his reason that was most profound, because he finished, his voice filled with a wonder he still could not fully grasp. There is no other God who can deliver like this. The golden statue, the monument to his own pride, now stood forgotten and irrelevant on the plain, dwarfed by the magnitude of the miracle that had just occurred. It was no longer a symbol of power, but a testament to folly. The furnace, once a tool of terror, had become an altar from which the glory of the God of Israel had been proclaimed to the entire world. In the days that followed, Nebuchadnezzar promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to even higher positions within the province of Babylon. Their trial by fire had become their ultimate vindication. They had faced the furnace not as a test of God, but as a test of their own faith, and in their unwavering obedience, they had become a platform for God's glory. Their story rippled through the empire, a whispered legend of the three Hebrews who walked through fire and the mysterious fourth man who walked with them. It was a powerful lesson. True faith is not about demanding to be saved from the fire, but about trusting the one who promises to be with you in it. Their steadfastness had not only saved their lives, but had forced a pagan king to praise the name of the Most High God, proving that sometimes the greatest testimonies are forged in the hottest flames. Years passed. The miracle of the fiery furnace receded into the annals of the court, a legendary tale that, like the king's first dream, lost its immediate, terrifying power over time. The empire flourished under Nebuchadnezzar's rule. His armies were victorious, his treasuries were full, and the city of Babylon became the undisputed wonder of the world. He built magnificent hanging gardens to please his queen, raised the city walls to impregnable heights, and constructed opulent temples and palaces that glittered under the Mesopotamian sun. With every new triumph, the king's pride, which had been so dramatically humbled, began to reassert itself. He started to see the prosperity of the empire not as a blessing from a higher power, but as the sole product of his own genius and might. The God of the Hebrews, who had revealed the future and commanded the flames, became a secondary character. In the grand drama of Nebuchadnezzar's own making, he was the architect, the creator, the master of his own destiny. It was in this state of swelling arrogance that he was visited by a second dream. Once again, he was shaken from his sleep, his heart pounding with a nameless dread. The vision was powerful and deeply unsettling. He saw a great tree in the midst of the earth, its height immense. It grew and became strong, its top reaching to the heavens, visible to the very ends of the earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruit abundant, and it provided food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens dwelt in its branches. It was a tree of life, a symbol of perfect strength, provision, and dominion. But then the dream took a terrifying turn. A holy messenger, a watcher, descended from heaven, his voice a thunderous command. Chop down the tree and cut off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee from under it and the birds from its branches. The vision was one of total, swift destruction. Yet it was not a complete annihilation. Nevertheless, the watcher commanded, leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, in the tender grass of the field. The watcher then spoke of the tree as a person. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. The purpose of this judgment, the watcher declared, was so that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets over it the lowest of men. Nebuchadnezzar awoke, deeply disturbed. Unlike the first dream, he remembered this one with perfect, horrifying clarity. He knew, instinctively, that the great and powerful tree was himself. He summoned his wise men, but once again, they were powerless. The magicians and astrologers could offer no plausible interpretation, their faces pale with fear before the king's obvious distress. Finally, the king sent for Daniel. By now, Daniel was an older, deeply respected figure in the court. His wisdom, a constant and reliable resource. When Daniel entered the throne room, the king recounted the dream, his voice laced with an anxiety he could not hide. As Daniel listened, a profound sadness and alarm filled his heart. The meaning was terrifyingly clear. His face grew troubled, and for a long moment after the king had finished, he stood in stunned silence. Belteshazzar, the king said, his voice softer now, sensing the gravity of the interpretation, do not let the dream or its meaning alarm you. Daniel finally looked up, his eyes filled with compassion for the proud, doomed man before him. My lord, he said softly, if only this dream were for your enemies, and its interpretation for your adversaries. With a heavy heart, Daniel revealed the truth. The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong. It is you, O king. You have grown and become strong. For your greatness has grown and reaches to the heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth. He then explained the horrifying judgment. The command to chop down the tree means you will be driven away from men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. They shall make you eat grass like oxen, and you shall be wet with the dew of heaven. 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he chooses. The king's face went ashen, to be driven from his throne, to lose his sanity and live like a wild animal. It was a fate worse than death. But Daniel added, pointing to the one sliver of hope in the dream, inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump of the tree's roots. Your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know that heaven rules. Seeing the terror in the king's eyes, Daniel made a heartfelt plea. Therefore, O king, let my advice be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by being righteous, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the poor. Perhaps there may be a lengthening of your prosperity. It was a call to repentance, a chance to avert the judgment through humility and righteous action. But the king, though frightened, was not yet broken. The warning was too humbling, the call to change too radical. A year passed, the dream faded into the background, and the king's pride, like a tenacious weed, grew back once more. One day, 12 months after the warning, Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof of his royal palace, surveying the breathtaking panorama of Babylon spread out beneath him. He saw the massive ziggurat, the fortified walls, the hanging gardens, the bustling streets, all a testament to his power. A wave of intoxicating pride washed over him. He drew himself up to his full height and boasted aloud to the empty air, his voice filled with self-adulation. Is not this great Babylon, that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? The words of arrogance had barely left his lips when a voice spoke from heaven, a voice that was not a whisper, but a clear, final verdict. King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. In that instant, something inside the king's mind snapped. The light of reason in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a vacant, animalistic terror. He let out a horrifying, guttural cry that was not human. His courtiers, rushing to the sound, found their mighty king on his hands and knees, clawing at the rooftop tiles, his eyes wide with a madness that no longer recognized them. The judgment had come. The great tree had been felled. The most powerful man in the world was driven from his palace, from his people, from his very humanity. He fled to the wilderness, where he lived as a beast. He ate grass like an ox. His body was soaked with the dew of heaven, and his mind was lost in a fog of insanity. His hair grew long and matted like eagle's feathers, and his nails grew sharp and curved like the claws of a bird. For 7 long years, the Golden King, the conqueror of nations, lived as a creature of the wild, a living, breathing parable of the catastrophic consequence of pride and a terrifying testament to the absolute sovereignty of the God he had forgotten. For 7 years, the throne of Babylon sat symbolically empty. The empire was governed by a council of regents, a system quietly and wisely guided from behind the scenes by Daniel. He ensured stability, quelled the ambitions of would-be usurpers, and maintained the official story that the king was suffering from a severe, prolonged illness that required absolute seclusion. It was a masterful act of statesmanship, preserving the kingdom while awaiting the fulfillment of God's prophecy. The world saw a powerful but ailing monarch, only a trusted. Few knew the horrifying truth of the king's condition. In the wilderness, Nebuchadnezzar's life was a brutal, primal existence. The intricate thoughts of a statesman and conqueror were gone, replaced by the simple, driving instincts of a beast: hunger, thirst, fear. He moved with the herds of wild oxen, his once powerful hands now calloused and stained from digging for roots. The man who had feasted on the world's delicacies now chewed on tough, bitter grass. The king who had slept on silken pillows now lay on the damp earth, the dew of heaven his only blanket. Time lost its meaning, measured only by the changing of seasons and the slow, relentless passing of the moon. He was a creature, no longer a creator. His identity, forged in power and majesty, had been completely erased, but the stump of the tree's roots remained. The core of his being, though bound by the iron and bronze of divine judgment, was preserved. God's purpose was not annihilation, but restoration. The humbling was a severe mercy, a painful surgery to remove the cancer of pride that was destroying his soul. At the end of the prophesied 7 years, something began to shift. One morning, as the first rays of dawn painted the eastern sky, the fog in Nebuchadnezzar's mind began to thin. A flicker of awareness, the first in a long age, sparked within him. He stopped his grazing and, for a reason he did not understand, he looked up, his eyes, for so long fixed on the ground in search of sustenance, lifted toward the heavens. As he stared into the vast, open sky, the floodgates of his memory and reason burst open. The 7 years of madness washed away in a single, overwhelming wave of clarity. He saw himself for what he was, a wretched, filthy creature, his hair matted, his nails like claws. And then he remembered who he had been, the king of Babylon. The sheer, horrifying contrast between the two realities brought him to his knees, not in madness, but in utter, soul-shattering humility. He was nothing. His power was an illusion. His majesty was dust. In that moment of perfect brokenness, his first sane act was not to cry out for his lost kingdom or his former glory. It was to praise the one who had humbled him. His voice, a harsh, unused croak at first, found its strength as he spoke to the heavens. I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. He would later write in a royal decree to the entire empire. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. His words became a hymn of profound, hard-won truth. His dominion is an eternal dominion. His kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. No one can hold back his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" The transformation was complete. It was not just a return of sanity. It was a spiritual rebirth. The king who had once boasted, "Is not this great Babylon that I have built?" now declared that all the peoples of the earth are regarded as nothing before the true king. As his sanity returned, so did his physical form. His long hair and nails fell away. His human consciousness, now cleansed of its pride, settled back into his being. At that very moment, his loyal courtiers, led by a hopeful Daniel, came searching for him. They found not a wild beast, but their king, clothed and in his right mind, his eyes shining with a wisdom that had been forged in the crucible of madness and humility. They brought him back to Babylon, not to the throne of a tyrant, but to the throne of a man who understood his place in the cosmos. His honor and splendor were returned to him, and his counselors and nobles sought him out once more. He was established in his kingdom, and an even greater majesty was added to him. He ruled now not just with power, but with a deep, abiding wisdom and a profound sense of gratitude. His first official act was to write his testimony, a royal proclamation sent to every nation, people, and language in his vast empire. It was a stunning, unprecedented act of public confession. He told the entire world of his pride, his dream, his descent into madness, and his ultimate restoration. He did not hide his shame. He glorified the God who had used it to save him. The decree ended with a final, magnificent chorus of praise. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride, he is able to humble. The story of Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar is a journey from the peak of human arrogance to the depths of divine judgment, and finally, to the freedom of true humility. It's a testament that no one is beyond the reach of God's transforming power. It reveals a God who opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble, a God whose sovereignty is absolute and whose ultimate goal is not to crush, but to redeem. Daniel, the faithful servant, remained a beacon of truth, a steady anchor in the storm of the king's life. He had stood firm in the face of fiery furnaces and political intrigue. But perhaps his greatest test was to patiently and prayerfully wait for a proud king's heart to be broken, so that the King of heaven could finally rebuild it. And in the end, the greatest miracle was not the interpretation of a dream or the survival in a furnace, but the transformation of a tyrant's heart into a worshiper's song.